Acre, 1391. The harbor chain still hangs like a final promise. A sea gate that can open barely onto escape. Beyond it, ships rock offshore. Not yet saviors. Not yet mourners. As if the sea itself is deciding what it will remember. But on land, the siege has already become a ring of iron camps. Trenches, engines closing with patient certainty. On the walls, the crosses of the hospital and the temple hold the last frontier of the Crusader coast. Watching the map shrink to a single city. This is not a fight for Acre alone. It is a fight over how an era ends. For nearly 2 centuries, the Crusader presence in the Levant had been contracting, castles lost, inland roads cut, once bold advances reduced to guarded corridors between a few coastal ports. What had been a kingdom of marching routes and open hinterlands became a strip of shoreline where every mile inland felt borrowed. As the interior fell away, the coast stopped being a frontier and became a dependence food. Men, weapons, and hope had to arrive by ship, because the land no longer belonged to them. That dependence hardened into doctrine: hold the harbors, keep the sea lanes, survive another season. And so the world narrowed to Acre, a fortress city with quays and warehouses pressed against thick walls, a place that could still be fed by the Mediterranean even as it was strangled from the fields beyond. The same water that made Acre strong also made it tempting, a lifeline so visible that everyone could measure their future by its mouth. Here, the Holy Land split in 2 meanings, an idea carried in prayers and banners, and a supply line carried in hulls and tides. Once Acre was surrounded, there would be no deeper line to fall back to, no inland refuge to reclaim the initiative. When the ring closed around this last harbor, the entire era would find itself pinned against the sea with nowhere else to go. The roll call begins where the stone meets the sky, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. Disciplined corps, trained for the worst minutes of a siege. Their mantles and crosses are more than symbols. Now they are rally points. The kind of presence that can stiffen a line when everything else starts to bend. Around them stand what remains of Frankish lordship nobles with retainers, commanders with pride, and rival jurisdictions packed into the same shrinking perimeter. Acre is not one army, but a crowded coalition forced into intimacy by danger. Where old arguments do not vanish, they simply become quieter, sharper, and more urgent. Then come the overlooked defenders, urban militia called from workshops and alleys. Sailors and dock workers who know the harbor like a map of veins, and foreign merchants entrenched in their own quarters. Each community guarding its interests as fiercely as its walls. The port feeds the city, but it also divides it profit and survival, sharing the same narrow streets. Outside chroniclers would later argue over numbers, swelling them into legend or compressing them into neat tallies. But inside Acre, the truth is simpler. Every capable hand is counted, not in totals, but in shifts and sectors. The city breathes through a patchwork of loyalties, stitched together by necessity. And as the first cracks begin to show in the outer defenses, and a harder question rises above the battlements when the breach opens. Who truly commands here? The enemy arrives with method, not impulse. An army that treats war like a craft refined over generations. The Mamluks come as a system-disciplined cavalry as the striking arm. Organized command to coordinate pressure. And engineers who know that walls do not fall so much as they are dismantled. They have watched Crusader strongholds rise and learned how they break. They have seen coastal fortresses depend on the sea. And they understand that to conquer Acre is not only to batter stone, but to control the land around it so tightly that the harbor becomes a narrow throat instead of an open door. And this is why 1391 is different from so many earlier clashes along this coast. It is not a raid meant to punish, not a campaign meant to bargain, but an operation meant to finish political will, fused with military planning, aimed at permanent removal of the last foothold. Chroniclers would later inflate numbers into legend, but the true weight of the assault is measured in something else: endurance, coordination, and resources applied without pause. This is a siege built to outlast courage, outwork repairs, and outthink relief. Soon the fields outside Acre will turn into a second city: camps, trenches, and siege parks, where the machine can assemble itself and begin its slow, certain work. From above the battlements, the countryside around Acre stops looking like land and starts looking like a diagram. A ring of camps takes shape with deliberate spacing fires at night. Banners by day, each position chosen to watch a gate, a road, a stretch of wall. The defenders can trace the perimeter like a tightening cord, and they understand what it means. The siege is not arriving. It is being built. Down at ground level, the ring has a soundtrack: shovels biting earth, picks striking stone, timber dragged into place, hammer blows that never seem to end. Trenches begin as scratches and become corridors, protected approaches that crawl forward under screens and earthworks. Every dawn reveals new mounds where yesterday there was flat field, and every mound is an argument written in soil. We are closer now. Behind the trench line, the siege parks form the engine room, organized spaces where crews assemble throwing machines, stack stones, sort timber, and prepare replacements for what breaks. This is not frenzy, it is routine, sustained by supply: food for men, fodder for animals, water, tools, rope, spare parts, and the discipline to keep working when excitement fades. An army that can eat on schedule and rotate labor can keep pressure on a wall long after a defender's courage has been worn into exhaustion. Inside Acre, that reality changes the meaning of bravery. A sortie might burn a structure or scatter a crew, but the ring absorbs shocks and reforms. Because its strength is not a single charge, it is persistence made visible. The city watches a second city rise outside its own, one designed for only one purpose, and the knowledge itself becomes a weapon. Out on the water, the harbor still glitters with possibility. The one opening the ring cannot fully close, but the land encirclement is meant to make that opening smaller in practice, turning the sea into a pressure point rather than an escape. With every new trench, the walls feel closer to the earth, and the days begin to feel like a countdown instead of a calendar. In Acre's harbor, the war has a different sound: oars creaking, rigging snapping in the wind, gulls circling above the salt-stained quays, lanterns flicker against masts and hulls, and the harbor chain sits like a drawn blade across the mouth of the port, a gate that can open, but not wide enough for everyone. Signals pass between ships and shore, and every glance out to sea carries a question that has no mercy. This water is Acre's advantage, the one line the siege cannot fully erase. By sea, supplies can sometimes slip in, small reinforcements can arrive, and morale can be fed by the simple fact that the horizon is not owned by the enemy. But the sea cannot lift a city out of a land siege. It cannot rebuild shattered walls or unbury men from collapsed stone. It can only move what the docks can handle, and the docks are finite. So the harbor becomes a place of calculation disguised as hope. Space on ships turns into triage, where wounded bodies, terrified families, armored fighters, and the city's most valuable goods all compete for the same narrow planks. Guards are posted, access is controlled, and yet control is always fragile because the harbor is not a fortress. Inside the fortress, it is a mouth, and panic moves like a flood toward mouths. Acre is also a merchant city, carved into quarters with foreign interests and long memories of rivalry maritime powers. Local shipping, guilds, and crews whose loyalties follow profit as much as banners. Their ships are lifeboats, but they are also businesses, and in a collapsing world. Those two identities grind against each other. Commanders need discipline at the waterfront. Merchants need order for loading. Civilians need a miracle. And each group measures survival in a different currency. That is why the sea shapes the battle on the walls as surely as the enemy's engines do. Certain towers and waterfront districts become existential, because if they fail, the route to the harbor fractures into chaos, and the chain becomes a mockery, a gate to nowhere. Every hour bought in the trenches, and battlements must be spent here, at the waterline, converted into boatloads and fleeting order. And as the siege tightens, the harbor does not feel larger, it feels narrower, like the last passage of an era closing behind its own footsteps. The bombardment does not feel like a series of blows, it feels like a clock. Stone after stone arcs in slow, indifferent curves, then arrives with a concussion that travels through masonry, timber, and bone. Dust blooms from the wall's seams. Shutters rattle in distant streets. And the defenders learn the rhythm the way sailors learn a storm, not by seeing it, but by living inside its repetition. This is how a breach is engineered in the late 13th century by patients armed with physics. Repeated impacts loosen faces of stone. Vibration widens hidden cracks, and repairs become a race against the next tremor rather than a return to strength. A wall can look intact while it is already compromised, because the enemy is not trying to win a single moment of combat, they are trying to make the structure fail on schedule. And while the sky delivers its metronome, the ground becomes another battlefield entirely. Sappers work in darkness, measuring with rope and instinct. Cutting into earth that muffles sound and multiplies fear, defenders answer with countermines. Listening for the faint wrongness of digging where no digging should be. It is war reduced to breath, sweat, and careful guesses timbers propping a tunnel. Soil packed back into place. The dread that a support will shift and the world above will suddenly become weight. Up on the walls, the real weapon begins to show its edge time. Watches blur into one another. Alarms never truly end. And manpower dwindles, not only from wounds, but from fatigue, hands shaking as they lift stones. Eyes stinging as they scan the same horizon for the 100th time. Routine breaks first. Then judgment, a late call. A missed signal. A section left undermanned for an hour that cannot be recovered. And this is the turning point most people never see in the legends. The breach is built long before it is visible, because endurance is being mined away minute by minute. Every extra night the wall stands must be converted into order at the harbor into controlled loading, guarded access, and precious space on hulls before panic turns the seagate into a trap. When the wall finally gives, it will feel sudden. But the machine has been preparing that sudden for weeks. A sortie at night can feel like victory, even when it is only interruption. Armored figures surging out under darkness, striking at earthworks, scattering crews, buying a few precious hours of confusion. Then morning comes, and the wall has to be manned again. And the missing faces turn the triumph into arithmetic that cannot be reversed. This is the defender's dilemma. In Acre, aggressive action can bruise the siege machine. But it also spends the one currency the city cannot replace. The Templars and Hospitallers can hit hard. They can stiffen a collapsing point. They can turn a gate into a weapon, yet they are not infinite. And every loss weakens the very sectors that must endure the final push. In a siege, courage is not only about charging out, it is also about refusing to spend men on moments that do not change the end. And the city behind the walls is not an empty stage. It is crowded, pressed tight into churches, cellars, and partitioned quarters where fear circulates like stale air. Smoke and firelight creep through streets, sickness threatens in packed rooms, and every decision at the battlements sends consequences downhill into families who have nowhere else to go. Strategy becomes moral injury. The knowledge that holding a wall might mean denying a dock, and saving a dock might mean abandoning a district. This is where the romantic image of a clean last stand begins to fracture. The defense is not one banner holding one wall. It is many walls, many sectors, and mixed units rushing wherever the pressure breaks next. Nobles, militia, sailors. The orders patched together by necessity and exhaustion. Food, space, and time become contested resources. And even the harbor's promise is a question of priority. In Acre, heroism exists, but it lives inside compromise. Every hour one outside the gate has to be transformed into order at the waterfront, or it becomes nothing more than another story told by men who did not make it to the ships. They called it the Accursed Tower, a name that sounds like superstition. But in a siege, it becomes shorthand for reality. Its silhouette rises over a vital stretch of wall, a hard point meant to anchor the defense and watch the approaches that feed directly toward the waterfront. If Acre is a ship pinned against the sea, this tower is one of the ribs that keeps the hull from splitting. In a coastal fortress, not every stone matters equally, and towers matter most of all because they stitch the wall line together. When a key tower fails, the wall does not simply lose a position, it begins to unzip, forcing adjacent sectors to bend backward, retreat, or collapse into isolation. The defenders can hold a gate for an hour and still lose the city if the tower that links their line turns into a gap, because the streets behind it become a corridor the enemy can pour through. So the accursed tower becomes a target with a schedule. Impact after impact works the masonry like a chisel made of time, and repairs become a nightly ritual. Fresh timbers, packed stone, hands raw from lifting, eyes stinging from dust. Accounts suggest that beyond the bombardment, undermining fears haunted the defenders too, the sense that the ground itself might be participating in the assault, hollowing out certainty beneath their feet. And with every day, the tower changes not in shape you can measure cleanly, but in the way it feels to stand in its shadow. The vibrations linger in the body, the cracks begin to look like sentences. The men assigned there start to glance at the harbor more often, as if they can already see the route of retreat written through the city. Because if this tower goes, the harbor-facing districts risk becoming kill zones and panic corridors, and the sea gate's promise turns into a funnel that can be controlled only by whoever reaches it first. By now, the accursed tower is still standing, but it is no longer whole. It stands like a warning embedded in stone. One more failure point, one more bad hour, and the last future of the Crusader coast will drop out from under the defenders suddenly, violently, and with nothing left behind it but the sea. The breach arrives like a snapped cord dust blasting outward, alarms multiplying, men running because the wall has stopped being a line and become a wound. In that instant, the physics of the fight changes, formations dissolve, orders shorten into gestures, and movement becomes the only rule that matters. Acre's streets turn into defensive geometry on the fly. Barricaded lanes choke into choke points. Doorways become firing angles. Courtyards become traps. And every corner is either a lifeline or a dead end depending on who reaches it first. Towers and gates that once made sense on a map become contested pivots measured in minutes. And the defenders' strength fragments into pockets that can no longer see one another. Accounts vary on the precise sequence which sector failed first, how quickly one collapse triggered the next, and exactly when withdrawals became routes. But the broad outcome is not in doubt. In May of 1391, Acre falls. and with it the last organized Latin hold on the Holy Land's mainland ends. What remains is not strategy, but survival inside a city that is suddenly too small for its own population. Smoke and firelight smear the skyline, and the sound of battle becomes a moving wall that pushes people ahead of it. The siege that had been patient and methodical on the outside becomes fast and chaotic on the inside. A flood of bodies and fear flowing through familiar streets that now feel unfamiliar. And every current in that flood runs in the same direction. Once the breach opens, the sea stops being a distant advantage and becomes a desperate destination. Everything in Acre sliding downhill toward the harbor, toward the chain, toward the last narrow opening that might still be open. The harbor is no longer a backdrop, it is a crisis that breathes. Ropes snap taut. Oars bang against gunwales. Waves slap the stone. And crewmen try to turn chaos into sequence, while the sound of alarms rolls down from the streets behind. Lines form, break, and reform. Because fear does not cue politely. Here, the war becomes triage in its purest form. Limited hulls, limited planks, limited minutes. The wounded slow the movement. The terrified accelerate it. And authority struggles to impose order on a crowd that understands the arithmetic before anyone explains it. The sea gate and its chain are a threshold that promises rescue, but only for those who can reach it in time, and only for those who are allowed through. Nobles, soldiers, merchants, and civilians compress into the same narrow routes, each group carrying a different version of what must be saved. Some cling to weapons, some to children, some to ledgers or relics, because the end of a city is also the end of identities built inside it. The harbor becomes Acre's final courtroom, judging without words, measuring each life against space and tide. And yet the sea does what the land will not. It preserves a path forward for a fraction of the trapped. Those who escape carry the end of Acre outward, towards Cyprus and other shores, turning personal survival into historical memory. The story does not die in the burning streets, it boards ships in silence, in sobs, in stunned exhaustion. Then the ships pull away, and the shoreline begins to recede like a closing page. Fires smear the city in orange and smoke. Shouting becomes distance. And the last harbor becomes what it always threatened to become: salvation for some, judgment for the rest, and the water between them widening with every stroke. Inside Acre, the map keeps shrinking. What had been a citywide defense contracts into a few hard points, stronger positions, thicker walls, corridors that can still be held where the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller become the spine of what remains. Their withdrawals are not retreats of fear, but of geometry, falling back to places where a smaller number of men can delay a larger force. These last holds are improvised fortresses inside a collapsing fortress. Barricades go up in doorways and streets. Passages are contested step by step, and time is purchased in minutes, not days. Each pocket of resistance buys something tangible at the waterfront: another boat pushed off, another cluster guided through the crush, another moment of order wrestled from panic. But siege warfare is merciless in its final phase, and courage does not stop stone from failing. Walls and towers that have absorbed weeks of vibration and undermining can give way without ceremony. And exhausted bodies cannot run forever through choking smoke and narrowing routes. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of some final collapses. Yet the shape of the end is consistent. Structure and stamina fail together, and the remaining redoubts become islands swallowed by the flood. When the last pockets are gone, Acre is not lost like a chess piece. It is erased as a base, and that difference is everything. The Crusader era in the Holy Land ends not by treaty, but by an emptied harbor and a ruined shoreline, survivors carried outward on the same sea that once brought pilgrims in. leaving the coast behind as memory and exile.